This pristine beachfront estate is your graduation gift, Julian. My father smiled proudly, holding up the gleaming silver keys for everyone to see. They had planned a massive celebration right in the grand foyer. I simply stood in the corner and checked my phone as the countdown hit 0 and the family trust finally activated. The security codes changed automatically, locking the entire system. Before I tell you how my spoiled brother and his greedy fiancée found themselves locked out of their own $1 million party, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to watch your toxic family reward the sibling who destroys absolutely everything. Growing up in our affluent circles in Atlanta meant everything was about legacy and keeping up appearances. My parents, Winston and Celeste, cared more about their standing in the community, their church board positions, and their exclusive country club memberships than they cared about the actual truth. I was the scapegoat, the daughter who refused to play their fake social climbing games. Tonight was supposed to be their crowning achievement. We were standing in the massive entryway of a gorgeous Martha Vineyard estate, surrounded by the local elite. The crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the imported marble floors. Servers in crisp white jackets circulated through the crowd, carrying silver trays piled high with caviar and truffles. Everyone who was anyone in our social sphere had shown up tonight. I recognized the mayor, the chief of police, and several prominent judges mingling near the grand piano. My parents had spent weeks calling every contact they possessed to ensure this gathering would cement their status as the most influential couple in our community. They thrived on the envy of others. It was the only air they breathed. Sign this catering invoice right now or find the exit. Harper, the shrill voice of my future sister-in-law Blair, cut through the smooth jazz playing in the background. Blair thrust a leather receipt holder directly against my chest. "It is $30,000. Blair smirked, flipping her blonde hair over her shoulder. "Pay up, college dropout. Consider it your contribution to the family legacy, since you clearly did not bring a graduation gift for Julian." The entire foyer went dead silent. Dozens of eyes turned toward me, waiting for my reaction. My mother, Celeste, stepped forward, adjusting her vintage pearls. She looked me up and down with absolute disgust. "I told you not to wear that ordinary dress to a function like this, Harper." My mother sighed loudly, ensuring the women from her social club could hear every word. "You look like one of the hired help. The least you can do is cover the food, since you refused to join the family business and disgraced us all by playing around with those little computer programs. Julian just earned his Master of Business Administration. He is the future of this family." I looked at my mother, and then at Julian, who was standing by the grand staircase, holding his new house keys like a trophy. Julian had taken 6 years to finish a simple 2-year degree because he spent most of his time partying and crashing expensive cars. My parents had bailed him out every single time while telling their friends he was a young business prodigy. Meanwhile, they had cut me off completely when I left medical school to start my own real estate technology firm. For years, they had systematically destroyed my confidence, telling me my ambitions were foolish and my dreams were worthless. I had spent countless nights crying in my cramped dorm room, wondering why I was never enough for them. I had watched them shower Julian with expensive sports cars, tailored suits, and luxury vacations, while I worked double shifts at a diner just to afford my textbooks. They had made me believe I was the problem. But standing here now in the center of the very house my hard work had secured, I felt nothing but a cold, razor-sharp clarity. The scared little girl they had bullied was gone forever. $30,000 for salmon and champagne, I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. That is quite a celebration. Do not pretend you cannot afford it. Winston. My father marched over and glared at me. I know you scrape by making those software apps or whatever it is you do. Put it on a payment plan. Julian deserves the best tonight. Do not ruin this for him. I did not argue. I did not cry. I reached into my purse and pulled out a solid metal black card. I handed it to the catering manager, who was standing awkwardly behind Blair. "Put the entire $30,000 on this," I told the manager smoothly. "And add a $5,000 tip for your staff. You all have done a wonderful job tonight." The manager's eyes widened as he saw the name on the heavy metal card. He ran it through his mobile terminal. A soft beep confirmed the transaction was approved instantly. Blair lost her smug smile. She stared at the receipt printing out from the machine. "Where did you get a limitless corporate card?" Blair demanded, her voice pitching higher. "Did you steal that from a client?" "I do not have clients, Blair." I smiled, taking the card back and dropping it into my purse. "I have tenants and investors, but please continue enjoying the party." Julian cleared his throat loudly, trying to draw the attention back to himself. He clapped his hands together and addressed the crowd. "Thank you all for coming," Julian announced, puffing out his chest. "As the new owner of this gorgeous property, I want to give everyone the grand tour. I just had the latest smart home technology installed yesterday. Watch this." Julian pulled out his brand new smartphone and opened the central security application. The crowd murmured in anticipation. My father beamed, placing a proud hand on Julian's shoulder. This was the exact moment they had been waiting for all evening. Julian pressed the button on his screen to unlock the master suite and the private wine cellar. Instead of a welcoming chime, the heavy electronic locks on the doors clicked shut with a loud mechanical thud. The digital panel on the wall flashed a bright warning light. "Access denied." The automated voice echoed through the grand foyer. "Ownership transferred." The silence in the grand foyer became suffocating. The smooth jazz music seemed to mock the sudden tension freezing the room. Julian frantically swiped his thumb across the polished glass of his screen, his manicured fingernails clicking against the device. Drops of sweat began to bead on his forehead, ruining his perfectly styled hair. He looked like a panicked child who had just dropped his favorite toy. Blair hovered over his shoulder, her perfectly contoured face contorting into an ugly scowl, as she realized their grand performance was falling apart in front of the very people they desperately wanted to impress. Julian frowned and tapped his screen again. The warning light flashed brighter. "Access denied," the voice repeated. "What is wrong with this stupid thing?" Julian muttered, tapping the screen harder. "Dad, the app is glitching. It says the ownership does not match." Blair grabbed the phone from his hand and tried to type in the manual override code. The panel beeped angrily and the screen turned completely red. "Why is it saying ownership transferred?" Blair asked, looking at Winston. "You said you bought this place for him." Winston stepped forward, his face turning a deep shade of crimson. He pulled out his own phone to call the security company. "It is just a technical error," Winston assured the crowd, forcing a tight smile. "These smart systems are always causing trouble." "Give me one moment." "It is not a technical error, Winston." I spoke clearly, and the sound of my voice cut through the rising panic in the room. Everyone stopped and looked at me. I walked slowly toward the center of the foyer, holding my own phone up for my family to see. On my screen was the master control panel for the entire estate, showing my name in bright green letters. "You cannot get into my house, Julian," I said, looking right into his panicked eyes. "Nana Trust activated exactly 10 minutes ago at 5:00. I am the sole owner of this estate." Winston dropped his phone. It hit the marble floor with a sharp crack. "What are you talking about?" Winston shouted, marching toward me. "I bought this property. I use the company accounts. You have nothing to do with this house." "You did not buy anything," I replied, standing my ground. 5 years ago, you threw me out on the street because I refused to be a pawn in your fake social climbing games. You called me a failure. But what you did not tell your country club friends was that your supply chain company has been secretly bankrupt for 2 years. You illegally mortgaged your own primary residence to fund Julian luxury lifestyle." Celeste gasped, grabbing the staircase railing to steady herself. The guests began to whisper furiously among themselves. "Shut your mouth," Winston ordered, pointing a shaking finger at me. "Do not speak about our family business in front of these people. They need to know who they are dealing with." I continued, raising my voice just enough to command the entire room. "You needed cash to buy this Martha Vineyard house to keep up your wealthy facade. So you went to a private real estate trust to secure a high-risk loan. You put up the last remaining shares of your failing company as collateral." Blair looked back and forth between me and Winston, her face pale. "Winston, tell her she is lying," Blair demanded, her voice trembling. "Tell her you bought this place for Julian. He took out a desperate loan." Blair. I answered for him. And the private trust he borrowed from belongs entirely to my real estate technology firm. I am the one who approved his loan. I am the one who holds the deed. And because Winston defaulted on his massive payment last month, the property was legally seized and transferred back to the trust. My trust. Julian stared at the keys in his hand as if they had suddenly caught fire. His entire identity was wrapped up in those keys in this house, in the false image of success he had done absolutely nothing to earn. He had spent his entire life taking credit for the hard work of others, skating by on his charming smile and our parents' endless financial bailouts. But a smile could not override a legally binding federal property transfer, and charm could not rewrite the code of the customized security system my engineers had finalized just hours ago. "These are the keys," Julian stammered, holding them up. "Dad gave me the keys. Those keys go to the old deadbolts." I smiled, pointing to the heavy electronic panels on the doors. "I had my company install the new smart locks yesterday morning. Those metal keys are absolutely useless, just like your business degree." "You planned this!" Celeste shrieked, pushing her way through the crowd to stand next to her golden child. "You vile, ungrateful little girl. You set your own father up to fail just so you could steal your brother's graduation gift." "I did not set him up," I replied calmly. "I simply let him face the consequences of his own financial fraud. You both spent years telling everyone I was the disgrace of the family. You told the church congregation I was a dropout who could not hold down a job. Meanwhile, I was building a $500 million empire from the ground up." The local elite who had spent the last hour praising my parents and congratulating Julian were now backing away from them. No one wanted to be associated with federal wire fraud and illegal mortgages. I watched my mother Celeste desperately try to grab the arm of one of her sorority sisters, only to have the woman pull away and walk toward the coat check. The social empire my parents had sacrificed my mental health to build was burning to the ground in front of their eyes. I just smiled, knowing they simply could not escape the absolute ruin they had carefully constructed for themselves all these long years. The heavy silence in the grand foyer was suffocating after the security system announced the transfer of ownership. Every wealthy guest in the room stared at me, standing there with my phone illuminating my face. My father, Winston, stepped forward, and the veins in his neck were pulsing against the collar of his expensive tailored suit. He had spent his entire life crafting an image of untouchable power, and seeing it challenged by the daughter he discarded was driving him to the edge of reason. He slammed his heavy hand down on the catered table so hard that a crystal champagne flute toppled over and shattered against the imported marble floor. The sharp sound made several of my mother's socialite friends flinch and step back toward the door. Winston did not care about the mess. He pointed a thick, trembling finger directly at my face, and his voice boomed through the high ceilings of the estate. He demanded to know what kind of sick game I was playing in front of his esteemed colleagues. He puffed out his chest and declared that he was the patriarch of this family and that he had personally used the company funds to purchase this property outright from the holding trust. He called me a delusional dropout who was desperately trying to steal the spotlight on the most important night of my brother's life. The venom in his words was so familiar. It was the exact same tone he used whenever I dared to question his authority or ask for basic respect when I was a child. Then he took a step closer, raising his right hand high in the air. I saw the intention in his eyes. It was the same heavy hand he had used to strike me across the face when I was 17, just because I had dared to ask why Julian was allowed to wreck a brand new car while I had to take the bus to my part-time job. He thought he could silence me now the same way he silenced me back then, through sheer physical intimidation and fear. But I was not that terrified teenager anymore. As his hand came swinging down toward my cheek, I reached out and caught his wrist mid-air. My grip was firm and unyielding. I did not flinch or look away. The shock on his face was absolute. He tried to pull his arm back, but I held it there for a long second, forcing him to look into the eyes of the woman he had tried to destroy. I swatted his hand away with a look of pure disgust and reached into my oversized designer tote bag. I pulled out a thick leather-bound financial dossier and threw it onto the table, right over the spilled champagne. The heavy thud of the document seemed to suck the remaining air out of the room. "With what money, Winston?" I asked, keeping my voice dangerously calm and entirely level. I refused to call him Dad. He had lost the right to that title a long time ago. "You stand here boasting about your corporate accounts and your wealth, but let us tell your friends the actual truth tonight." My mother Celeste stepped forward, clutching her vintage pearls. She tried to order me to stop speaking, telling me that I was having a mental breakdown and embarrassing the family legacy. I ignored her entirely, keeping my eyes locked on Winston, who was staring at the leather binder as if it were a bomb waiting to detonate. "5 years ago, you threw me out of the house in the middle of a thunderstorm." I continued, making sure every guest in the room could hear the history they had tried so hard to bury. "You told me that dropping out of medical school to pursue real estate technology made me a permanent stain on the family name. You actually packed my bags yourself and threw them into the wet driveway while Julian watched from the porch. You told me I would never amount to anything and that I was cut off without a single cent to my name." I paused, letting the weight of those memories settle over the crowd. Several of the judges and politicians who had been drinking my father's expensive liquor were now whispering to each other, casting judgmental glances at my parents. "But in reality, your logistics company has been completely bankrupt for over 2 years." I revealed, watching the remaining color drain from my father's face. "You lost your biggest distribution contracts because you were too busy playing golf and attending country club dinners to notice the industry was changing. Your supply chain empire is nothing but a hollow shell drowning in commercial debt and unpaid vendor invoices." Winston tried to interrupt me, sputtering that I was lying and making up stories because I was jealous of my brother. But I tapped the thick leather binder on the table, inviting anyone in the room to open it and look at the audited bank statements I had legally acquired during the foreclosure process. "You needed cash desperately to keep up this facade of being the elite black family of Atlanta," I said, my voice echoing off the curved walls. "You needed to fund Julian's ridiculous playboy lifestyle because admitting your son was a failure would mean admitting you were a failure. So you secretly took out a massive second mortgage on the primary family estate back home. The house where I grew up, the house my mother spends hours decorating for magazine spreads, is completely leveraged to the bank." Celeste gasped loudly and grabbed Winston's arm. Her carefully contoured face twisted into an expression of sheer horror. She demanded to know if what I was saying was true. She asked him how he could possibly mortgage their home without her signature. The perfect society wife was finally realizing the ground beneath her designer shoes was entirely rotten. I did not stop. The flow of truth was a rushing river, and I was going to drown them in it. "You took that leveraged money, and you threw it away on Julian." I continued, pointing at my brother, who was still staring dumbly at his useless phone. "You paid off the lawsuits when he crashed 2 separate luxury sports cars while driving under the influence. You funded his 3 failed startup companies that never even had a working business plan. And when Blair demanded a destination engagement party in Dubai, you drained the last of your employee pension funds to pay for it." Blair shrank back against the staircase, suddenly looking very small in her expensive evening gown. She had married into this family specifically for the generational wealth they promised her, and now she was realizing she had tied herself to a sinking ship. "When the banks finally cut you off, Winston, you went looking for private equity lenders who asked fewer questions," I explained, detailing the exact trap he had walked right into. "You found a private real estate trust, willing to give you a high-risk mezzanine loan so you could buy this Martha's Vineyard property and pretend everything was fine. You put up the absolute last remaining shares of your hollow company as collateral along with the deed to this very house." My father looked like he was struggling to breathe. His chest heaved and his hands shook as he looked around the room, realizing that his elite friends were witnessing his total unmasking. "What you were too arrogant to realize is that the private holding trust you borrowed from is a subsidiary of my real estate technology firm," I said, allowing a small cold smile to touch my lips. "I am the one who reviewed your desperate application. I am the one who approved the loan, knowing exactly what you were doing. And because you defaulted on your massive payment last month, the property was legally seized and transferred back to the trust. My trust. I own the debt, I own the company's shares, and I own this house. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal and the financial ruin hung over the room. My mother, Celeste, began to hyperventilate. The social standing she valued more than her own daughter's life was turning to ash. She turned on Winston, hitting his chest with her fists, screaming at him for destroying her life and making her a laughingstock in front of the mayor and the country club board members. Winston tried to grab her hands, begging her to calm down and promising he could fix it with a few phone calls to his investors. The perfect family was tearing itself apart right in the middle of the grand foyer. The guests were actively stepping away from them, treating my parents like they carried a contagious disease. All the years of snide comments, all the holidays where I was told to sit at the end of the table, all the times they praised Julian while ignoring my achievements, it all culminated in this beautiful, disastrous moment. I stood there watching the chaos, feeling an incredible sense of vindication. I had not needed to destroy them. Their own greed and obsession with maintaining a fake image had done all the heavy lifting. I simply held up a mirror and let the world see the reflection. But just as Celeste began to sob hysterically into her hands, the dynamic in the room shifted again. Julian, who had been standing silently by the stairs with a vacant look of panic, suddenly began to chuckle. The sound was jarring against our mother's crying. The chuckle grew into a full, arrogant smirk as he stepped out from behind his distraught parents. He adjusted the cuffs of his tailored suit and walked slowly toward the table where my financial documents lay. The frightened little boy routine vanished completely, replaced by the entitled golden child who always believed the world belonged to him simply because he demanded it. He did not look like a man whose entire life had just been exposed as a fraud. He looked like a man holding a winning lottery ticket. Julian reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and took his time pulling out a folded piece of heavy legal paper. He smoothed it out deliberately, running his fingers over the creases before holding it up for me to see. "That is a very impressive story," Harper Julian said, his voice dripping with condescension and unearned confidence. "You really had everyone going for a minute there. It is almost sad how much effort you put into trying to ruin my big night just because you are bitter that Mom and Dad love me more." I narrowed my eyes, keeping my posture relaxed but going on high alert. Julian was an idiot, but he was a manipulative idiot who spent his life watching our parents twist the rules to suit their needs. He walked right up to me and shoved the heavy legal paper into my hands. I looked down at the document. It was a formal quitclaim deed specifically detailing the transfer of all assets holding companies and physical properties associated with the private trust I had established. I scanned the paragraphs of legal jargon, my mind racing to process what I was looking at. The document explicitly named Julian as the sole beneficiary and manager of the trust, effectively giving him total control over the very financial trap I had built for our father. And there at the bottom of the final page was my signature. It was perfectly executed, matching the exact loops and sharp angles of the signature I used for all my high-level corporate contracts. "Too bad, sis," Julian smirked, leaning in so close I could smell the expensive cologne our parents had bought him for graduation. "You really should keep better track of your paperwork. You signed the entire holding trust over to me last month." The heavy cream paper felt thick between my fingers as I stared down at the perfect forgery. Julian stood there with that infuriating smirk plastered across his face, radiating the unearned confidence of a man who had never faced a real consequence in his entire life. Blair stepped out from behind him, her eyes glittering with malicious triumph. She crossed her arms over her expensive silk gown and looked at me like I was a cockroach that had just been exterminated. "You really thought you could outsmart us?" Harper Blair sneered, her voice carrying easily across the silent marble foyer. "You thought you could just waltz in here and steal Julian birthright? Well, your little tech company belongs to my fiancé now, which means this beautiful house belongs to us." Celeste let out a dramatic sigh of relief, clutching her chest as if she had just survived a near-death experience. Winston straightened his tailored jacket, his posture returning to that of the untouchable patriarch. They did not even question how Julian had suddenly acquired my multi-million-dollar company. They did not care if the document was stolen or forged. They only cared that the golden child had magically restored their social standing in front of the Martha Vineyard elite. Winston pointed toward the heavy oak front doors. "Get out of my house, Harper," he commanded, his voice booming with restored authority. "You tried to humiliate us in front of our friends. You tried to ruin your brother's graduation party. You are a jealous, pathetic loser, and you are no longer welcome in this family." I did not move a single muscle. I kept my eyes locked on the forged signature on the quitclaim deed. The ink strokes were an exact replica of how I signed my corporate tax filings. It was not a digital copy. Someone had physically traced and replicated it with absolute precision. It took a special kind of desperate greed to execute a forgery this bold. When I did not immediately turn and run crying toward the exit, Blair let out a theatrical scoff. She pulled her latest model smartphone from her designer clutch and tapped the screen with her manicured fingernails. "If you are not going to leave peacefully, then we will have you removed, like the common criminal you are," Blair announced loudly, making sure the mayor and the local judges heard every single word. She dialed 911 and put the phone on speaker, holding it up for the room to witness her ultimate victory over the outcast daughter. "Hello, police emergency," the dispatcher voice echoed from the phone, filling the tense silence of the room. "Yes, I need to report a hostile trespasser at the Winston estate in the Bluffs," Blair said, putting on her best distressed victim voice. "My deranged sister-in-law has broken into our private graduation party. She is violently harassing the guests and refusing to leave the property. We feel extremely threatened right now. Please send officers immediately." The dispatcher promised that patrol cars were on the way, and Blair ended the call with a satisfied click. She looked around the room, soaking in the sympathetic glances from my Mother Country Club friends. Celeste shook her head in faux sorrow, playing the part of the tragic mother to absolute perfection. "I never understood why you grew up to be so bitter," Harper Celeste lamented, wiping an imaginary tear from her cheek. "We gave you everything. We sent you to the best schools. And you throw it all away to become this angry, jealous creature who cannot stand to see her own brother succeed in life." The guests began to murmur among themselves. I could hear the hushed whispers of the elite crowd. They were saying it was a shame how the oldest daughter turned out so unstable. They were congratulating Winston on raising such a sharp businessman in Julian to handle the family affairs. They were completely buying the illusion that I was nothing more than a disgruntled failure, trying to steal a slice of the family wealth because I was too lazy to earn my own. I let them talk. I stood in the center of the foyer, holding the forged deed, feeling a profound sense of calm wash over me. I had spent my entire adolescence trying to prove my worth to these people. I had starved myself studying for medical school exams just to see a glimmer of pride in my father's eyes. I had paid off my mother's secret shopping debts, hoping she would finally look at me the way she looked at Julian. But standing here listening to them eagerly label me a criminal, I realized they were never going to love me. They only loved the utility I provided them. And now that they thought I had no utility left, they were eager to watch me be hauled away in handcuffs. The distant wail of police sirens began to echo through the coastal night air. The sound grew louder and more piercing, cutting through the murmurs of the wealthy guests. Julian puffed out his chest, looking toward the front doors like a conquering hero who had just slain a dragon. "You should have just walked away when Dad told you to, Harper," Julian said, shaking his head in mock pity. "Now you are going to be arrested in front of half the town. Do not worry, though. I will make sure the trust sends you a little allowance for the prison commissary." The heavy oak doors swung open, and 3 uniformed police officers stepped into the foyer. The flashing red and blue lights from their cruisers illuminated the driveway outside, casting frantic shadows across the imported marble floors. The guests parted like the Red Sea, giving the officers a clear path to where I stood holding my designer bag. Blair immediately rushed forward, pointing an accusing finger directly at my face. "Officer, thank goodness you are here!" Blair cried out, clutching Julian's arm for dramatic effect. That woman is Harper. She crashed our private party and is making wild claims about owning our property. We want her arrested for trespassing and harassment immediately before she hurts someone." Winston stepped up beside his daughter-in-law, using his deep, authoritative voice to take control of the narrative. "Officers, I am Winston, the owner of this estate. This is a private family matter that has unfortunately escalated. My daughter is not well. She has a history of mental instability, and she refuses to leave the premises. Please escort her off the island so we can enjoy our evening." The lead officer, a tall, broad-shouldered man with graying hair, stepped forward. It was Chief Morrison, the head of the local police department. He had served the island community for 20 years and knew every wealthy family that vacationed here. He was not a man who was easily swayed by expensive suits or dramatic tears. Chief Morrison bypassed Winston completely. He did not even acknowledge Blair's pointing finger. Instead, he walked directly up to me and stopped. The entire room held its breath, waiting for him to pull out his handcuffs and drag the family disappointment away in disgrace. Instead, Chief Morrison took off his uniform cap and gave me a respectful nod. "Good evening, Miss Harper," Chief Morrison said, his tone deferential and polite. "We received a call about a disturbance at your property. Is everything secure here? Do you need us to remove anyone from the premises?" The collective gasp that rippled through the grand foyer was loud enough to be heard over the ocean wind outside. My mother Celeste stumbled back, bumping into a waiter carrying a tray of champagne. Julian dropped his jaw, his smug smile vanishing into a mask of pure, unadulterated confusion. Blair let out an indignant squawk. "What are you doing?" she demanded, marching toward the police chief. "You are supposed to arrest her. She is trespassing on Julian property. We have the deed right here to prove it." She signed it over to him. Chief Morrison finally turned to look at Blair, his expression hardening into professional authority. I suggest you lower your voice. Miss Harper legal team filed the finalized property transfer documents with the county clerk office early this morning. I personally reviewed the security protocols for this estate with her security director yesterday. Miss Harper is the sole legal owner of this residence, and she is the only one who dictates who stays and who goes. Winston's face turned purple with absolute rage. "That is impossible," he shouted, his voice cracking. "Julian just showed us the quitclaim deed. Harper signed the entire trust over to him. It is a legal binding document verified by lawyers." I slowly folded the forged paper in my hands and looked directly at Blair. She was visibly shaking now, her eyes darting between me and the police officers. She knew exactly what was coming next, but she was completely trapped. "It is funny you mentioned that deed, Winston," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the silent room, "because when you run a $500 million real estate technology firm, you learn very quickly that paper documents are incredibly easy to manipulate. That is why my company relies on biometric security and continuous surveillance for all sensitive materials." I reached into my bag and pulled out my tablet. I tapped the screen, syncing it with the massive 85-inch television mounted in the adjacent living room. The smooth jazz music had stopped entirely, leaving only the sound of my calm, steady voice ringing out in the quiet house. "You see, Blair?" I continued, walking slowly toward my terrified sister-in-law. "When Julian told you about the holding trust last month, you realized that marrying into this family meant marrying into a bankrupt legacy. You saw the financial reports Winston carelessly left around his home office. You knew the money was completely gone, and you knew I was the only one holding the purse strings to your glamorous future." Blair opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Her hands were trembling so violently that her diamond engagement ring caught the chandelier light in frantic flashes. "So you decided to take matters into your own hands and secure your own future," I said, tapping a final button on my tablet. The massive television screen flared to life. The high-definition security footage was crystal clear. It showed the interior of my private executive office at my firm in Atlanta. The timestamp in the corner indicated the footage was captured at 2 in the morning exactly 3 weeks ago. The crowd of elite guests leaned in, their eyes glued to the bright screen. They watched in absolute silence as a figure cloaked in a dark hoodie used a cloned keycard to bypass the main lobby and enter my personal office. The figure moved straight to my locked filing cabinet, using a small pry bar to force the top drawer open. The intruder pulled out several thick physical contracts and laid them out under the desk lamp. Then the figure pulled down the hood and looked directly up at the hidden camera mounted flush against the smoke detector. It was Blair. Her blonde hair fell across her face as she pulled out a specialized tracing pad. She carefully and meticulously copied my signature from a finalized commercial lease agreement onto a blank piece of paper, checking her work multiple times to ensure it was absolutely perfect. She even wiped down the desk with a cloth afterward, thinking she was being incredibly clever and leaving no trace of her crime. The collective silence in the room broke into a massive wave of shocked whispers. My mother covered her mouth with both hands, unable to process the criminal act unfolding on the screen. Winston stared at the television as if it were an alien transmission. Julian looked at his fiancée, his eyes wide with horror and disbelief. "Blair, you stole her signature?" Julian whispered, taking a massive step away from her as if she were carrying a plague. Blair was hyperventilating now, tears ruining her perfect makeup and staining her silk gown. "It was for us," she cried out, grabbing Julian's jacket. "They had all the money, Julian. Your father lost everything and she had all of it hoarded away. I was just trying to make sure we got what we deserved. We are family. We are supposed to be rich." I stepped forward, breaking the distance between us. I stood inches away from Blair, looking down into her terrified, watering eyes. "Did you really think I would not have hidden cameras in my own executive office?" "Blair," I asked softly but firmly, "did you think the CEO of a tech firm worth $500 million just leaves her corporate security to chance? I watched you trace that signature live from my phone while I was sitting in a hotel room in London. I let you take it because I wanted to see exactly how stupid you and Julian truly were." Blair let out a choked sob, shrinking back against the cold marble of the grand staircase. "Forging a simple family document is a terrible mistake." I continued, my tone devoid of any sympathy or warmth. "But using that forged signature to attempt to transfer ownership of a federally regulated private real estate trust across state lines, that crosses a very massive legal boundary." Chief Morrison stepped up beside me, his hand resting casually on his heavy utility belt, ready to take action. "Forging federal financial documents carries a mandatory 10-year sentence." Blair, I stated the brutal facts, letting them echo through the foyer. "And conspiracy to commit wire fraud carries another 10. You did not just try to steal from me. You committed a massive federal felony on camera, and then you called the police to the scene of the crime yourself." Blair turned completely pale. All the blood rushed from her face, and her knees buckled instantly. She slumped against the stairs, sobbing hysterically, begging Julian to help her, pleading with me that it was a huge mistake and that she would rip up the deed right now if I just let her walk away. But the golden child was too busy staring at the floor, realizing that his entire future, his promised wealth, his status, and his upcoming marriage were completely built on lies and incompetence. He had nothing to offer her and no way to save her. When Blair tried to catch her breath, the sound was a ragged wheeze of pure panic. The wealthy elite guests who had just spent the entire evening drinking my father's expensive champagne were now actively backing away from him as if his failure was contagious. The mayor was already whispering to his wife, signaling that it was time to leave before the scandal attached itself to his political campaign. The judges were looking at the floor, pretending they had not just witnessed a federal crime unfold in front of their eyes. I looked at Winston as he stood there panting and threatening me with media destruction. The man who had terrified me for so long. The man who had convinced me that my worth was tied entirely to his approval, now looked like nothing more than a pathetic bully. He had no power left over me. The financial report on the table and the security footage on the screen were undeniable proof of his complete failure as a businessman and as a father. Blair continued to weep on the marble stairs, her designer gown pooling around her in a crumpled mess. She reached out for Julian again, but he stepped further away, unable to look at the woman who had just guaranteed her own prison sentence in a desperate bid for money that did not even exist. The perfect facade of the elite African-American family that Winston and Celeste had sacrificed my sanity to maintain was now completely shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Winston, however, refused to surrender. His massive pride was a rabid animal trapped in a corner. He could not accept that the daughter he hated had completely outmaneuvered him and exposed his beloved family as common thieves and desperate liars. He pushed past the murmuring guests, his face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. Sweat dripped down his forehead, ruining his perfectly manicured image. He stopped inches from the police chief, pointing a trembling, furious finger at me. "If you press charges against my family, I will make you regret you were ever born." Winston roared, his voice cracking with desperation and rage. "I know the board members at your firm. I know the investors. I will go to every news station in Atlanta and tell them you are a sociopath who set up her own brother. I will drag your name through the mud until your stock plummets to zero. Then I will destroy you in the media." Winston's threat hung in the heavy ocean air, thick with desperate rage, and the sudden realization that his fake empire was crumbling. But my mother did not even wait for him to make good on his promise to call his media contacts. Celeste had spent her entire adult life curating a flawless image for her thousands of followers. She was the former president of her elite sorority chapter, the head of the church hospitality board, and a staple in the local luxury lifestyle magazines. She knew exactly how to weaponize public opinion, and she was ready to burn me at the stake to protect her golden child. She snatched her smartphone from her designer purse, her hands trembling slightly, but her eyes completely cold and calculating. Within seconds, she had the Instagram live feed running. I watched in a state of detached fascination as she forced her breathing to become shallow and ragged, instantly summoning the tears of a heartbroken matriarch. It was a performance worthy of a seasoned actress. She held the phone up high, making sure the crystal chandeliers, the sweeping marble staircase, and the gathered police officers were perfectly visible in the background, framing the shot to make our family look like the wealthy, innocent victims of a sudden, unprovoked attack. "Oh my God! Everyone, please pray for us right now," Celeste sobbed into the camera, her voice shaking with manufactured terror. "My oldest daughter Harper is having a severe mental breakdown tonight. We are at our new vineyard estate for Julian graduation celebration, and she just snapped out of nowhere. She brought the police here with fake documents trying to steal her own brother house. We have tried so hard to get her psychiatric help over the years, but she is completely unhinged. She is trying to destroy our family out of pure jealousy because she could never handle Julian's success." The viewer count on her live stream skyrocketed almost immediately. 500, then 1,000, then 3,000. People were suddenly watching my mother put on the performance of a lifetime. I could see the comments flooding the bottom of her screen in a rapid stream of text. Women from her country club were leaving praying hands emojis and gasping in horror. Members of our old church congregation were typing how tragic it was that I had turned out to be such a bitter disappointment to such a God-fearing family. People I had gone to high school with were commenting that they always knew there was something deeply wrong with me, and that my parents deserved so much better. Winston stood behind her looking sorrowful and defeated, playing the part of the exhausted father carrying the burden of a crazy daughter. Blair deliberately sniffled and sobbed loudly in the background, wrapping her arms around Julian to add to the tragic atmosphere. They really thought this would work. They honestly believed that a few thousand sympathetic comments on social media could magically overwrite federal property laws and wire fraud. They thought public shaming was the ultimate weapon because to them reputation was the only currency that mattered in this world. They expected me to cower in shame, to beg her to turn off the camera, to surrender my company and my assets, just to stop the public humiliation. That is how they had always controlled me when I was younger, by threatening to embarrass me in front of the people who mattered. But I did not interrupt her. I did not shout or try to defend myself to her virtual audience of sycophants and gossips. I simply turned my back on her ridiculous performance and walked over to the massive glass coffee table in the center of the sunken living room. I picked up the sleek silver remote control for the 85-inch smart television that dominated the far wall. The elite guests and the police officers watched me in curious silence, unsure of what the crazy daughter was about to do next. Celeste was still weeping to her followers, telling them how much she loved me and how it broke her heart to see me lose my mind like this. I pressed the power button on the remote. The massive screen flared to life, casting a bright bluish glow over the tense faces in the room. I tapped a few buttons on my own phone, routing my secure server directly to the television premium audio system. I turned to face my mother, camera holding my head high. "If you are going to broadcast our family business to the entire world," "Celeste," I said, my voice cutting easily through her fake sobbing, "then you should probably let your followers hear the whole story. Let us give them something completely authentic for once in your life." I pressed play on my phone. The surround sound speakers built into the ceiling of the grand estate crackled to life. The audio was crystal clear, recorded just 2 weeks ago from the hidden microphone installed in the private library of my Atlanta corporate office, where Julian and Blair thought they were completely alone. Julian's voice echoed through the massive room, arrogant and dripping with disdain. It was not the voice of the innocent golden child my mother was currently portraying to her thousands of viewers. It was the voice of a greedy parasite who had finally run out of other people's money to spend and was ready to cut the cord. I cannot stand another minute of listening to the old man brag about his fake empire. Julian's voice boomed from the speakers, vibrating through the floorboards. "Dad is completely broke and he is dragging us down with him. Once we get rid of Harper and secure this vineyard house, we are liquidating everything." Then Blair's voice chimed in, sharp and calculating, her tone utterly devoid of the sweet southern charm she usually faked for my parents. "What about your parents, Julian? They think they are moving in here with us. They think this is going to be their new summer retirement home to show off to their friends." Julian let out a cruel, mocking laugh that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It was a laugh filled with pure malice. "Please," he scoffed on the recording, his voice echoing around the silent foyer. "The second the ink is dry on that trust transfer, we are dumping those two old fools in the cheapest state-run nursing home we can find. I am not spending my prime years taking care of a bankrupt has-been and a delusional socialite. We will bleed their remaining credit lines, dry pack our bags, and move to Europe. Let Harper deal with their miserable elderly years. They deserve each other." The audio clip ended with a sharp click, leaving an oppressive, heavy silence in the room. The jazz music was long gone. The police officers stood absolutely still, their hands resting on their belts. The wealthy guests who had just been whispering about my supposed mental breakdown were now staring at Julian and Blair with wide, unblinking eyes of pure horror. The absolute sociopathic cruelty of the Golden Boy had just been broadcast not only to the room, but to the thousands of people watching the live stream. But it was my mother's face that told the real story. All the fake tears instantly dried up, evaporating into the cold air. Her perfectly manicured hands began to tremble so violently that the smartphone slipped from her grasp. The device hit the hard marble floor with a sickening crack. The screen spider webbed into 1,000 jagged pieces, and the Instagram livestream abruptly went completely dark, terminating her broadcast of her own absolute humiliation to every single person she cared about trying to impress. Winston looked like he had been physically struck by a freight train. His mouth hung open and his eyes darted frantically around the room, trying to make sense of what he had just heard. The man who had mortgaged his entire life, who had committed federal fraud, who had thrown his own daughter out on the street just to provide for his precious son, had just heard that very son plotting to throw him into a rundown facility and steal his last remaining dime. All the sacrifices, all the lies, all the generational wealth he had pretended to build had been for a boy who viewed him as nothing more than an ATM waiting to be discarded. The silence finally broke, and it did not break with words. It broke with sudden explosive violence, Celeste let out a guttural, agonizing scream that sounded like a wounded animal caught in a trap. The polished, elegant society wife vanished entirely. She lunged across the marble floor, her expensive heels slipping as she closed the distance between her and Julian in a split second. She raised her hand and slapped the golden boy across the face with such incredible force that the sharp crack echoed off the high ceilings like a gunshot. Julian stumbled backward, clutching his reddening cheek, his eyes wide with genuine terror. He tried to hold his hands up in defense, but Celeste was already screaming at him. "How could you?" she shrieked, her voice tearing at the seams, her carefully pinned hair falling around her face in a wild mess. "I gave you everything. I destroyed my own daughter for you. I lied for you to everyone we know. I stole for you. And you are going to throw me away like trash." Winston did not say a single word. The betrayal had completely shattered his mind. He simply charged forward with a terrifying roar, grabbing Julian by the lapels of his expensive custom-tailored suit and shoved him hard against the wooden banister of the grand staircase. The wood groaned under the sudden impact. Julian shouted for him to stop begging and stammering that the audio was fake, that I had used artificial intelligence to manipulate his voice, that it was all a setup. But nobody was buying his pathetic lies anymore. His voice was shaking, and the cowardly truth was written all over his face. Blair screamed and tried to pull Winston off her fiancé, but Celeste grabbed Blair by the shoulder of her silk gown and yanked her backward. My mother called her a parasitic gold digger who had poisoned her son, demanding she get out of the house. Blair shrieked and shoved Celeste back, causing my mother's vintage pearl necklace to snap. Dozens of white pearls scattered across the marble floor, bouncing and rolling in every direction. The perfect elite African-American family, the pinnacle of Martha Vineyard high society, was literally brawling on the floor like common thugs in a bar fight. The pristine image they had guarded with their lives was entirely demolished. The police officers finally had to step in. Chief Morrison grabbed Winston by the shoulders and pulled him away from a cowering Julian, while another officer stepped between my mother and a hysterical Blair, who was frantically trying to smooth her torn dress. The officers shouted for everyone to back down and remain where they were, threatening to put them all in handcuffs if they did not stop immediately. I stood by the coffee table and watched them tear each other to shreds. I did not feel a single ounce of pity or sadness. This was the exact consequence of their lifelong obsession with maintaining a fake image at the expense of reality. They had built a house of cards on a foundation of lies and theft and cruelty, and now it was collapsing in the most spectacular and public way possible. They had finally turned the knife on themselves. As the police struggled to keep my parents restrained, and Blair sobbed loudly against the banister, the heavy front doors of the estate groaned open one final time. The cold coastal wind swept into the foyer, bringing with it the scent of sea salt and incoming rain, causing the crystal chandeliers to sway and clink together. A tall, impossibly rigid man stepped over the threshold into the chaos. He wore a dark, charcoal suit that looked completely untouched by the harsh weather outside. His silver hair was slicked back with severe precision, and his face held the neutral, unforgiving expression of a man who dealt exclusively in hard truths and legal finalities. It was Mr. Caldwell, the senior managing partner of the elite law firm that had handled my grandmother's estate for the last 4 decades. He was a man who terrified even my father. Mr. Caldwell carried a weathered black leather briefcase in his right hand. The silver clasps gleamed under the swaying chandelier light. He did not look surprised by the heavy police presence, or the chaotic fighting, or the pearls scattered across the floor. He simply wiped his leather shoes on the entry mat, cleared his throat, and walked directly into the center of the room, commanding absolute silence through his mere presence alone. The officers stopped pushing Winston back. Celeste froze, her breathing ragged and heavy. Julian and Blair pressed themselves against the stairs, looking at the lawyer as if he were the Grim Reaper arriving to collect their souls. Mr. Caldwell set his heavy leather briefcase down on the only table that had not been overturned in the commotion. He clicked the silver latches open with two sharp snaps, producing a crisp white envelope sealed with thick red wax, bearing my grandmother's personal crest. He looked at my father, then at me, and finally at the disgraced golden boy shivering by the stairs. "I apologize for the late intrusion," Mr. Caldwell said, his voice smooth and cold as a razor blade cutting through the remaining tension in the room. "But the strict terms of the trust demanded I wait until this exact moment of the evening to deliver this. There is one final envelope from Nana." The heavy silence that followed Mr. Caldwell's words was absolute. You could hear the rain lashing against the massive windows of the estate and the distant crash of the ocean waves. But inside the grand foyer, nobody dared to breathe. The officers who were holding my father back loosened their grip just enough for Winston to straighten his ruined suit. He was bleeding social capital by the second, and his fragile ego could not handle the presence of a man who commanded more respect than he did. Winston pushed himself away from the police officers and took a heavy step toward the lawyer. His face was still flushed a violent shade of crimson, but he tried to force his features into a mask of calm authority. He extended his hand, expecting Mr. Caldwell to simply hand over the heavy parchment envelope. "Give that to me," Winston ordered, his voice dropping an octave as he tried to project the power he no longer possessed. "I am the patriarch of this family, and I am the executor of my mother's estate. Whatever she left behind goes through me. I decide what happens in this house, and I decide when these matters are discussed." Mr. Caldwell did not even blink. The older lawyer looked at Winston's extended hand as if it were a piece of garbage that had blown in from the street. With a swift and incredibly cold motion, Mr. Caldwell brushed my father's hand away, swatting it down with the edge of his leather briefcase. Winston recoiled in shock, holding his wrist. "You decide absolutely nothing, Winston," Mr. Caldwell said, his voice echoing with icy precision. "Your mother legally removed you as executor of her estate 3 years ago, when she realized you were financially compromising the family legacy. This envelope is addressed to the entire family, and it will be read exactly as she instructed." The guests in the room shifted uncomfortably, but no one looked away. The mayor was leaning against the grand piano, watching my father complete dismantling. My mother Celeste remained frozen on the marble floor, the broken pearls from her necklace digging into her knees. Julian and Blair were still pressed against the staircase, looking like two trapped animals waiting for the hunter to strike. Mr. Caldwell broke the thick red wax seal with his thumb. The sharp cracking sound made Julian flinch. The lawyer pulled out several pages of heavy stationery, covered in my grandmother's elegant sweeping handwriting. He adjusted his silver-framed reading glasses and began to speak. The words belonged to Nana, but the commanding delivery belonged entirely to Mr. Caldwell. "To my family," the letter began. "If Mr. Caldwell is reading this to you, it means my trust has officially activated, and the truth can no longer be hidden behind expensive suits and country club smiles. I have spent the last decade of my life watching Winston tear apart everything my husband and I built from the ground up." Mr. Caldwell paused, allowing the weight of the opening statement to settle over my father. Winston looked like he wanted to scream, but the police chief put a heavy hand on his shoulder, keeping him pinned in place. The letter continued detailing how Nana had known for years that Winston Logistics Company was bleeding money. She knew about the terrible investments and the reckless spending. But worst of all, she knew about the grotesque favoritism. "I watched you," Winston the lawyer read from the pages. "I watched you and Celeste elevate a lazy, arrogant boy to the status of a king, while you actively destroyed the brilliant, beautiful daughter who actually inherited our family work ethic. You cast Harper out because she refused to be a puppet in your pathetic social climbing theater." Celeste let out a small, pathetic whimper, burying her face in her hands. She had spent her life worshipping Nana legacy, trying to be the perfect society daughter-in-law, and hearing the dead matriarch call her out so ruthlessly was breaking whatever was left of her mind. Julian stared blankly ahead, his jaw slack. But leaving everything to Harper was not a random act of spite. Mr. Caldwell continued, reading his voice, carrying a dark, ominous tone. It was an act of preservation. Because Winston did not just bankrupt his own company, he stole from our community. The entire room gasped. The whispers erupted instantly, but Mr. Caldwell raised his hand, demanding silence. When Julian racked up $1 million in illegal gambling debts and crashed his third luxury vehicle, Winston realized his bank accounts were empty. So he embezzled money from the Sanctuary Church Fund. He drained the minority scholarship accounts that I set up 40 years ago to help underprivileged kids in Atlanta go to college. He stole the future of dozens of children just to cover up his own son's criminal incompetence. The reaction from the elite guests was explosive. The mayor looked physically sick. Several judges shook their heads in absolute disgust. Winston had positioned himself as a pillar of the Atlanta community, a generous benefactor who sat on the charity boards. To hear that he had secretly drained the very funds he publicly championed was the ultimate betrayal. Stealing from a charity to protect a spoiled drunk driver was a stain that could never be washed away. Winston closed his eyes, looking completely defeated as the entire room turned on him. Mr. Caldwell flipped to the next page of the letter, but those funds did not remain empty. The lawyer read, his eyes flicking up to meet mine for a brief second. When I discovered the embezzlement, I was prepared to hand Winston over to the authorities. But Harper came to me. The daughter you threw out on the street, the girl you told your friends was a useless dropout, had quietly built an empire in the real estate tech sector. When she learned what her father had done, she used her own corporate profits to secretly replenish the church accounts and the scholarship funds. She pumped millions of her own dollars into the community to save the family name, while you, Winston, were actively dragging her name through the mud. I stood tall, letting the truth wash over me. I remembered the long nights sitting in my cramped office wiring money to the charity boards through anonymous shell companies, just to make sure those kids got their college tuition. I had not done it for Winston. I had done it for Nana, and for the legacy of my grandfather. The wealthy guests who had been looking at me with suspicion all night were now staring at me with profound awe and respect. The same women who had mocked my simple dress were now looking at me like I was a savior. My mother stared up at me from the floor, her makeup streaked with tears, realizing that the daughter she treated like dirt had single-handedly saved her from federal prison and absolute social exile. Mr. Caldwell cleared his throat, drawing the attention back to the final page of the letter. Which brings me to Julian. The lawyer read, his voice hardening. The golden child who has coasted his entire life on unearned privilege and endless bailouts. Julian, you broke this family apart with your bottomless greed and your stunning lack of character. You have never worked a hard day in your life, and you have happily watched your sister suffer while you reap the rewards of her stolen inheritance. Therefore, you are officially cut off. You will not receive a single cent from my estate. You will not inherit a single piece of property. You will not receive any trust distributions. You are entirely on your own. Julian let out a strangled gasp, his hands gripping the wooden banister so tightly, his knuckles turned white. He looked like he was going to vomit. But Mr. Caldwell was not finished. However, the lawyer read, pulling the final sheet of paper forward. I am not entirely without mercy. I have left one final provision for Julian, one opportunity to earn a living wage and perhaps learn the value of actual labor. Julian will be permitted to receive a monthly stipend of $2,000 from the family trust, but only under one very specific condition. The room was so quiet, you could hear the wax paper rustling in the lawyer's hands. Julian must sign a binding legal contract to work as a full-time janitor at Harper Real Estate Technology Firm for exactly 3 years, Mr. Caldwell read, emphasizing every single syllable. He will clean the toilets. He will empty the trash bins. He will mop the floors. He must report directly to Harper every single morning. There will be no skipping shifts, no sick days without a doctor note, and absolutely no special treatment. If he quits, if he is fired for incompetence, or if he fails to complete the full 3 years, the stipend is permanently revoked, and he will be left with absolutely nothing. The sheer humiliation of the clause hit Julian like a physical blow to the stomach. The golden boy, who was standing there in a tailored suit wearing a Rolex watch that cost more than a car, was suddenly facing a future holding a toilet brush. Julian's face contorted into a mask of pure, hysterical panic. He let go of the banister and began to scream, his voice cracking in absolute refusal. "No!" he shrieked, stomping his feet against the marble stairs like a giant toddler throwing a tantrum. "No, I will not do it. I am an MBA graduate. I am a business executive. I do not clean toilets. You cannot make me do this. This is illegal. Dad, do something, tell them I will not do it." Winston just stood there staring blankly at the floor, completely broken and unable to save his precious son. The police chief was still holding his arm, and there was no money left to buy their way out of this nightmare. Julian continued to scream and thrash, pulling at his own hair, demanding that someone fix it. He looked incredibly pathetic, and the entire room of influential guests was watching him fall apart, realizing exactly how weak and useless he truly was. But the final and most devastating reaction came from Blair. She was still leaning against the staircase, her designer gown covered in dust from the floor, her face stained with ruined makeup. She had married Julian, or planned to marry him, because she thought he was her ticket to endless wealth and a life of luxury. She had risked everything, even committing a federal felony on camera, just to secure this beautiful Martha Vineyard estate. And now she was looking at the man she had tied herself to. Blair stopped crying. The tears simply dried up, replaced by a look of utter, absolute disgust. She stared at Julian as he wept and screamed about not wanting to mop floors. She looked at his pathetic thrashing and realized that her entire future was chained to a literal janitor who was completely under the control of the sister she had just tried to defraud. Her meal ticket was gone. Her luxury lifestyle was gone. She was looking at 10 years in a federal prison, and the man who was supposed to protect her was crying over a toilet brush. Blair slowly stood up, smoothing out her ruined silk dress, and locked eyes with me across the room. Blair locked eyes with me across the room, and I could actually see the mechanical gears turning in her calculating head. The illusion of the billionaire heir had evaporated entirely, and all that was left was a weeping man-child who was about to spend the next 3 years emptying my trash cans just to afford a basic living stipend. She looked down at Julian, who was still curled against the bottom step of the grand staircase, clutching his knees and sobbing about how unfair his life was. Blair let out a sound of pure, unadulterated revulsion. She reached for her left hand and gripped the massive 5-carat diamond engagement ring that Winston had secretly paid for using stolen charity funds. She had spent the last year shoving that ring into the face of every single person she met, treating catering staff and boutique employees like peasants, simply because she wore a rock on her finger. She ripped the ring off with such violent force that it left an angry red mark across her skin. She did not even hesitate for a second. She threw the heavy platinum ring directly at Julian's face. It bounced off his forehead with a sharp smack and clattered against the marble floor, rolling away into the shadows of the foyer. "I am not marrying a janitor," Blair spat, her voice echoing through the silent room. "I did not spend the last 2 years smiling at your insufferable mother and listening to your father golf stories just to end up scrubbing toilets for a living. You are pathetic, Julian. You are absolutely nothing without their money, and you are completely useless to me now." Julian flinched as if she had shot him in the chest. He reached out for her, begging her not to leave him, saying they could figure it out together, and that he would find a way to get the money back from the trust. But Blair had already stepped over his outstretched legs, treating him like a piece of garbage that had blown into her path. She smoothed down the front of her ruined silk designer gown and walked deliberately toward me. Her entire posture changed in an instant. The weeping, terrified victim routine vanished completely, replaced by the cold, calculating survivor she truly was. She squared her shoulders and tilted her chin up, trying to project an air of mutual respect that she had never once earned. Chief Morrison stepped forward to intercept her, but I held up my hand, signaling him to wait. I wanted to hear exactly what the parasite was going to propose. Blair stopped just a few feet away from me. She glanced nervously at the police officers and then leaned in, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper, as if we were two old friends plotting a hostile corporate takeover. "Look, Harper," she whispered, her eyes darting toward Winston, who was still breathing heavily against the wooden banister. "You and I both know this family is a sinking ship, but you do not know the half of it. Winston did not just embezzle from the church and the minority scholarship funds. He has been hiding assets from the federal government for years. I know all about his hidden offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands and the Bahamas. I found the account numbers and the routing codes hidden in a false bottom of his home office safe when I was looking for the holding trust documents last month." She smiled a slick, oily smile that made my skin crawl. It was the same condescending smile she used to give me at family dinners when she would make snide comments about my unstyled hair or my lack of a rich husband. "I am the only one who has the physical proof of his federal tax evasion," Blair continued, her voice trembling with desperate greed. "Give me $1 million, just $1 million wired to my personal account right now, and I will hand over every single piece of evidence. I will testify against him in federal court. I will give you the final nail in his coffin so you can put him away forever and keep everything for yourself. Just pay me and let me walk out the front door before the federal authorities realize what is going on." I stared at her perfectly contoured face, taking in the sheer audacity of her proposal. She had just been caught on camera committing a federal felony, and her immediate instinct was to try and extort me for $1 million by selling out the father of the man she had promised to marry just 5 minutes ago. I let out a low, humorless scoff that made her confident smile falter instantly. "Did you honestly think I would not know about the offshore accounts, Blair?" I asked, speaking loudly enough for Winston and the police chief to hear every single word. Winston's head snapped up, his eyes widening in fresh panic as he realized what his prospective daughter-in-law was trying to do. "Did you think a man as arrogant and careless as Winston could hide millions of dollars without leaving a digital footprint the size of the Grand Canyon?" I continued, taking a step closer to her. "I built the exact financial tracking algorithms that the Federal Reserve uses to flag illicit offshore wire transfers. My real estate technology firm specifically designed the compliance software that caught his sloppy little shell company transactions over a year ago. I do not need your stolen account numbers, Blair. I have had his entire financial history mapped out on my encrypted servers since last Thanksgiving." Blair took a step back, her face falling as her only perceived leverage evaporated into thin air. But it was my turn to dismantle her entirely. "What I find truly fascinating, though, is the secondary routing algorithm I discovered while I was monitoring Winston accounts," I stated, walking slowly around her like a predator circling its prey. "You see, Winston gave you a supplementary black card for wedding expenses because he wanted to pretend he could afford to give you the royal treatment. He wanted to show off to your side of the family. But you were not just buying imported floral arrangements and custom champagne, were you, Blair?" She began to shake her eyes, darting toward the heavy oak front doors, plotting an escape route that did not exist. I tapped my tablet, bringing up a new set of documents on the massive living room television. Rows of highlighted bank transfers appeared on the glowing 85-inch screen for every wealthy guest to see. "For the last 8 months, you have been secretly funneling thousands of dollars from Winston corporate credit accounts directly into a dummy shell company registered in your rural hometown," I stated clearly, letting the facts echo through the room. "You were draining his stolen money to pay off your parents' trailer park mortgage. You bought your brother a brand new truck in cash. You even paid for your sister cosmetology school tuition using stolen charity funds that you illegally wired out of Winston corporate accounts." Blair let out a high-pitched gasp, bringing both hands to her mouth to stifle a sob. She looked at Julian, who was staring at her with a mixture of betrayal and absolute horror. The entire room of socialites and politicians murmured in shock. The classism in the room was palpable as the wealthy elite turned on her instantly. The sweet, innocent country girl who had charmed her way into the elite Atlanta social circle was nothing more than a common thief bleeding a bankrupt man dry to fund her own impoverished family back home. "You are not a witness, Blair," I said, my voice dropping to a deadly calm register. "You are a co-conspirator. You actively participated in the embezzlement, and you committed wire fraud across state lines to cover your tracks. You left digital fingerprints on every single transaction because you were too arrogant to realize you were playing a game you did not understand. You thought you were the smartest person in the room, but you were just a parasite feeding off a dying host." As if on cue, a new sound pierced the heavy coastal air outside. It was not the standard wail of local police cruisers. It was the deep, heavy sirens of federal tactical vehicles approaching the estate. The flashing lights illuminating the rain-slicked windows were bright red and blue, but they were accompanied by the unmistakable heavy tires of armored federal SUVs crunching up the long gravel driveway. Chief Morrison tapped his radio, confirming that the Federal Bureau of Investigation field agents he had contacted earlier that evening were finally arriving to secure the financial crime scene and execute the outstanding warrants I had helped them prepare. The sound of the federal sirens completely shattered whatever was left of Winston's sanity. The realization that federal agents were pulling up to his driveway meant that this was no longer a local scandal he could try to bury with a few well-placed bribes or a quick call to a golfing buddy on the police force. This was federal prison. This was the complete and total annihilation of his freedom, his social standing, and his carefully crafted name. The untouchable patriarch of Atlanta elite society was about to be walked out of a graduation party in handcuffs while the entire town watched. Winston ripped himself away from the local officers, grabbing the edge of the marble table to steady his trembling body. His tailored suit hung off him like a trash bag, his posture completely broken. He stumbled toward me, his eyes wild and bloodshot with absolute terror. The man who had towered over me my entire life, the man who had struck me and thrown me out in the rain, now looked like a terrified, broken old man. He reached out and grabbed the sleeve of my designer blazer, his thick fingers digging into the fabric with a desperate, crushing grip. "Harper, please," he begged, his voice a pathetic, high-pitched whine that stripped away every ounce of his dignified persona. "You cannot do this. You have to tell them it is a mistake. You have to stop them from coming inside. We are blood, Harper. You are my daughter. I am your father. Harper, please." I looked down at his shaking hand gripping my sleeve and felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no sorrow, no familial warmth. He pointed a shaking finger at Blair, who was currently collapsing into a sobbing heap on the floor as the heavy boots of federal agents began to march up the front stone steps of the estate. "Look at her," Winston pleaded, yanking on my sleeve, tears streaming down his face, mixing with the sweat on his cheeks. "She is the one who stole the money. She is the parasite who drained us dry. She set us up, Harper. You cannot let them take me. You cannot let us black folks get put in federal handcuffs over some white girl mess. Please, Harper, save your family." I snatched my arm out of his grasp so violently that the seam of his custom-tailored jacket audibly ripped in the silent foyer. The physical sensation of his sweaty, desperate fingers slipping off my designer blazer made my skin crawl. Winston stumbled forward, losing his balance and nearly falling to his knees before catching himself against the bottom rung of the grand staircase. He looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes, still expecting the obedient little girl who used to flinch at his shadow to suddenly step in and shield him from the consequences of his own actions. "Blood?" I asked, my voice dropping to a deadly whisper that seemed to echo off the crystal chandeliers above us. "You want to stand here in the middle of the mess you created and talk to me about blood and family loyalty? You want to use our race as a shield to protect you from the federal authorities after you spent your entire life stealing from the very community you pretended to uplift." Winston opened his mouth to speak, but I did not give him the chance to formulate another pathetic excuse. I stepped closer to him, forcing him to cower against the wood paneling. "Do not you dare try to blame this all on Blair," I continued, pointing a finger down at the sobbing woman on the floor. "Yes, she is a parasite who drained your accounts, but she only walked through a door that you left wide open. You were bankrupt long before Julian brought her home. You were embezzling money from the sanctuary church fund long before she learned your vault combination. You stole the futures of hundreds of underprivileged kids from our neighborhood just so you could keep buying imported cars and hosting lavish country club dinners. Do not use our race to cover up your rot, Winston. You are not a victim of some white girl mess. You are the architect of your own complete destruction. My mother Celeste let out a strangled gasp from where she sat amidst her broken pearls. She tried to reach out to me, her hands shaking violently. "Harper, please," she whimpered, her voice barely recognizable without its usual arrogant lilt. "People are watching. The mayor is right there. You are destroying our legacy. We can fix this quietly. We are a prominent family. We cannot let them see us like this." I turned my gaze to Celeste, letting the absolute disgust wash over my features. There is no legacy, Celeste. There is only a mountain of debt and a trail of victims. And as for your sudden concern about blood and family, let us talk about exactly what family means to the two of you. I looked back down at Winston, who was panting heavily, his chest heaving under his ruined shirt. "Do you remember my junior year of college?" "Winston?" I asked, the memories flooding back with a sharp, agonizing clarity. "Do you remember when I collapsed in the middle of the campus library because I was working 3 part-time jobs just to pay for my textbooks while carrying a full pre-med course load? I was hospitalized for 3 days with severe exhaustion and malnutrition. My body completely gave out. I called you from that sterile hospital bed with an IV in my arm, begging you for a simple $5,000 loan to cover my medical bills and keep me from getting evicted from my dorm." Winston swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward the floor, unable to meet my gaze. The guests in the room were dead silent, listening to the horrific reality of the perfect family they had admired for decades. "I begged you!" I repeated, my voice vibrating with years of suppressed rage. "I cried on the phone to you and told you I was scared. And do you remember what you said to me? You told me that my medical bills were not your problem. You told me that the $5,000 I needed was already earmarked for Julian fraternity pledging fees. You actually said the words networking is more important than your little stress headache. You chose to buy your son a spot in a party house over the health and safety of your own daughter." Celeste looked away, covering her face with her hands, but I refused to let them hide from the truth any longer. "Do you know how I paid that hospital bill, Winston?" I asked, stepping even closer until he had to press his back flat against the stairs. "I sold my blood plasma. I sat in a dingy clinic twice a week with a thick needle in my arm, watching my literal blood being pumped into plastic bags, just so I could afford to eat and keep a roof over my head. I gave pieces of my own body to survive while you were busy throwing thousands of dollars at Julian so he could buy expensive liquor for his frat brothers. So do not ever look me in the eye and talk to me about blood. You drained my blood a long time ago." Julian, who was still cowering near Blair, let out a pathetic whimper, trying to make himself as small as possible. He had always known the truth about where his money came from, but hearing it laid out so brutally in front of the local elite was finally shattering his delusional reality. The golden child was nothing but a bloodsucker who had thrived on my suffering. Winston began to openly weep, the tears tracking through the dust and sweat on his face. He sank slowly to his knees, his expensive dress pants sliding against the marble floor. He raised his hands in a gesture of absolute surrender, begging me to show him the mercy he had never once shown me. He pleaded that he was old, that his heart could not take the stress of a trial, that he would do anything I wanted if I just called off the federal agents. But the heavy thud of tactical boots marching up the front stone steps drowned out his pathetic apologies. The massive double doors of the estate were thrown open with a violent crash. The cold ocean storm rushed into the foyer, carrying a brutal gust of wind that blew out the decorative candles scattered across the catering tables. A dozen heavily armed federal agents poured into the grand entryway. Their dark tactical gear stood in stark, terrifying contrast to the silk gowns and tailored tuxedos of the party guests. The flashing red and blue lights from the armada of vehicles outside illuminated the room in sharp, frantic bursts of color. Chief Morrison immediately stepped back, signaling his local officers to stand down and relinquish jurisdiction to the federal authorities. The guests scrambled backward, pressing themselves against the walls and the grand piano, desperate to avoid getting caught in the crossfire of the FBI raid. The agents moved with terrifying efficiency, securing the perimeter, blocking the exits, and taking up positions around the cowering forms of my parents and my brother. Winston let out a high-pitched wail of pure terror, wrapping his arms around his own head as if trying to physically block out the reality of his arrest. Celeste screamed and tried to crawl backward across the floor, but an agent firmly planted a booted foot in her path, cutting off her escape. Blair simply buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably as she realized her life of luxury was officially over and a prison cell was waiting for her. Then the crowd parted down the center as the lead investigator walked slowly through the front doors. He moved with a calm, imposing authority that demanded absolute respect. He did not rush, and he did not shout. His presence alone was enough to silence the remaining murmurs in the room. He wore a dark, tailored suit under a heavy tactical jacket, the federal badge gleaming brightly on his chest. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and possessed a quiet, dangerous intensity that made everyone in his path instinctively step out of the way. Winston peeked out from behind his arms, his tear-streaked face twisting in confusion as he looked up at the lead investigator. Celeste stopped crawling and stared, her mouth hanging open in utter disbelief. Even Julian managed to lift his head, his eyes widening to the size of saucers. The lead investigator unclasped the heavy tactical helmet he was wearing and pulled it off, running a hand over his perfectly faded haircut. He looked down at Winston kneeling on the marble floor, and a slow, cold smile spread across his handsome face. I felt my own lips curve into a genuine smile for the first time that entire evening. The knot of tension that had been sitting in my chest finally dissolved completely. "Devin," I said, my voice soft, but carrying easily in the quiet room. "You are exactly on time." Devin. My husband of 3 years walked over to me and gently kissed my cheek, his strong hand resting reassuringly on the small of my back. He looked at the financial dossier on the table, then down at the ruined family groveling at our feet. "I told you I would not miss the main event." "Baby," Devin said, his deep voice resonating with quiet power. "The warrants were signed an hour ago, the offshore accounts are frozen, and the local field office has already secured Winston corporate headquarters in Atlanta." Winston stared at Devin as if he were looking at a ghost. He tried to speak, but only a strangled gurgling sound escaped his throat. Celeste looked like she was about to pass out entirely. The irony of the moment was so thick you could choke on it. For years, my parents had relentlessly mocked Devin. When I first brought him home to meet them, they had treated him like an absolute peasant. They ridiculed his civil service salary. They laughed at his modest background. Celeste had once famously told her friends that I was ruining the family pedigree by dating a blue-collar government worker who was completely beneath our social standing. She had even refused to let him use the front door during a Thanksgiving dinner, telling him to enter through the kitchen with the catering staff so he would not embarrass her in front of the neighbors. They had called him worthless. They had called him a gold digger who was only with me because I was a Wilson. They had spent years trying to convince me to leave him for a wealthy legacy kid who could elevate my status. And now, that very same man, the man they had degraded and dismissed as beneath them, was standing over them holding their entire future in the palm of his hand. Devin reached into the inner pocket of his tactical jacket and pulled out a thick stack of folded federal warrants. He did not hand them to the local police, and he did not hand them to Winston. He simply held them up, letting the official seals catch the light of the chandeliers. "Winston," Devin said, his tone dripping with absolute professional detachment, "you are under arrest for multiple counts of federal wire fraud, embezzlement of charitable funds, and tax evasion. Your assets have been seized, your passports are revoked, and your little escape plan to Europe is officially canceled." Celeste let out a fresh wail of despair, crying out to Devin, begging him to show them mercy because they were family. She actually had the audacity to call him her son-in-law, trying to weaponize the relationship she had spent years trying to destroy. Devon did not even look at her. He kept his eyes locked on Winston, who was trembling so violently his teeth were chattering. "You once told me I would never amount to anything in your world." Winston Devon continued stepping closer until his shadow completely engulfed my father. "You told me I was not fit to sit at your dinner table. Well, you were right about one thing. I do not belong in your world of fraud and lies. But tonight, you belong to my world. And in my world, we put thieves in a federal cage." Devon signaled to the agents standing behind him. Two heavily armed officers stepped forward, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from their belts. The metallic clicking sound echoed through the foyer as they grabbed Winston's arms and wrenched them behind his back. Winston cried out in pain and humiliation as the cold steel clamped down over his wrists. Celeste screamed as two more agents approached her, pulling her up from the floor by her arms. She kicked and thrashed, demanding they unhand her, screaming that her dress was couture and that they were ruining her reputation. The agents ignored her, entirely slapping the cuffs on her wrists and dragging her toward the door. Blair did not even put up a fight. When the agents approached her, she simply held out her trembling hands, sobbing quietly as the cuffs clicked into place. The reality of her 10-year federal sentence had completely broken her spirit. And then there was Julian. The golden child, the heir to the fake empire, the boy who was supposed to inherit the world. He watched his parents being dragged away in handcuffs, and he completely lost whatever remained of his mind. He scrambled backward up the marble stairs, trying to crawl away like a terrified infant. He looked at me, his face streaked with tears and snot, his expensive suit ruined. "Harper, please," he begged, his voice cracking into a high-pitched squeal. "Tell them I did not know. Tell them I was not part of the fraud. I will do whatever you want. I will sign the janitor contract. I will clean the toilets. I will mop the floors every single day. Please just do not let them arrest me. I cannot go to prison, Harper, please." I looked at the brother who had mocked me, stolen from me, and happily watched our parents destroy my life. I walked over to the bottom of the stairs and looked up at him. "You are not going to prison, Julian," I said softly. "The federal agents do not want you. You are too incompetent to have actually participated in the embezzlement. You are just the gaping black hole they threw all their stolen money into." Julian let out a massive sigh of relief, a wet, pathetic smile breaking through his tears. "Thank you, Harper. Thank you," he cried, trying to reach for my hand. I stepped back out of his reach. "But do not think for 1 second that you are walking out of here a free man, Julian. Because Nana's final letter was very clear. You owe the trust 3 years of manual labor. And if you want to eat or sleep indoors for the foreseeable future, you are going to show up at my corporate office on Monday morning at 6 a.m. sharp. I expect the lobby floors to be spotless before I arrive." Julian's smile vanished, replaced by a look of dawning horror as he realized his nightmare was just beginning. He was not going to a federal cell, but he was going to spend the next 3 years scrubbing floors for the sister he had spent his entire life bullying. He had absolutely nothing left. No money, no family, no fiancé, and no dignity. I turned away from him and walked back to Devon, who wrapped his arm around my waist, drawing me close. We stood together in the center of the grand foyer, watching as the agents hauled Winston, Celeste, and Blair out into the raging coastal storm, pushing them into the back of the armored federal vehicles. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated their terrified faces one last time before the heavy doors slammed shut, sealing their fate. The wealthy elite guests remained frozen against the walls, too terrified to move or speak. They had come to celebrate a coronation, and instead they had witnessed a complete and total annihilation. I looked around the beautiful, massive estate, the property I had secured with my own blood, sweat, and tears. The jazz music was gone. The fake laughter was gone. The toxic parasites who had drained my life for decades were finally removed. I looked up at Devon and smiled, the heavy weight of my past finally lifting off my shoulders completely. "It is a bit messy right now," I said, leaning my head against his chest. "But I think we are going to love it here. The sheer reality of seeing Devon standing there in his federal tactical jacket completely short-circuited whatever was left of Winston's brain. The parents who had spent years treating my husband like an absolute peasant were now staring at him as if he were an executioner sent to collect their souls. My father's jaw was slack, and his eyes darted from the gold federal badge on Devon's chest to the heavily armed agents fanning out across the foyer. When I first brought Devon home to Atlanta to meet my family, Winston had refused to even shake his hand. My father had looked at Devon Motta's civil service vehicle and his off-the-rack suit and openly laughed. Winston had told his country club friends that I was going through a rebellious phase by dating a blue-collar government worker who could barely afford to take me to a decent restaurant. Celeste had been even worse, telling everyone that Devon was a gold digger trying to secure a piece of the Wilson family fortune. They had degraded him, dismissed him, and treated him like dirt beneath their expensive shoes. And now that very same man was standing in the center of their illegally acquired mansion, holding their entire future in the palm of his steady hand. Winston's chest began to heave as panic finally overrode his shock. He stumbled backward away from Devon, his hands frantically patting down the pockets of his ruined custom suit. He pulled out his sleek smartphone, his thick fingers shaking so violently he nearly dropped the device on the marble floor. "I am calling the governor." Winston stammered his voice, a breathless, high-pitched wheeze that sounded nothing like the confident patriarch he pretended to be. "This is a massive misunderstanding. I play golf with the federal judge in this district. I fund the mayor campaigns. They will call off these dogs right now. You cannot just walk into my house and do this to me." He tapped the screen desperately, putting the phone on speaker so Devon and the agents could hear him summon his powerful friends. The ringing tone echoed loudly in the cavernous room, mixing with the sound of the rain beating against the windows. But nobody answered. A generic voicemail greeting clicked on. Winston cursed under his breath and dialed another number, his eyes wide and frantic like a trapped animal looking for an open window. He called the state senator who had eaten dinner at our house just last month. It went straight to voicemail. He called the police commissioner who had accepted thousands of dollars in donations from Winston corporate accounts. Another voicemail. Winston looked around the grand foyer, his panic turning into a suffocating absolute terror. The wealthy guests who had been drinking his champagne and eating his caviar just an hour ago were actively stepping away from him, pressing their backs against the walls to distance themselves from a sinking ship. The mayor, who had been standing near the grand piano earlier, had already slipped out the back doors the second Mr. Caldwell started reading the letter. Winston was completely and entirely alone. All the political connections, all the country club buddies, all the judges he thought he had bought had abandoned him the second the federal sirens wailed. He was radioactive, and nobody was going to sacrifice their own career to save a man caught red-handed in federal fraud. Devon did not interrupt my father's frantic phone calls. He simply stood there with his hands resting casually on his tactical belt, watching the arrogant patriarch realize that his money could no longer buy his salvation. Devon let Winston experience the agonizing total isolation of his new reality before he finally decided to put an end to the pathetic display. "Secure the scene!" Devon ordered, his voice carrying a calm, authoritative weight that cut through the silence. His agents immediately moved into action, blocking the massive front doors and standing guard at the archways leading deeper into the estate. "Winston Davis," Devon said, his eyes locking onto my father's terrified face. "You can put the phone away, Winston. There is no one left to call. Your accounts are frozen. Your assets are currently being seized by field agents back in Atlanta, and your political friends have already handed over their communication records to my office to save themselves." Devon reached into his tactical jacket and pulled out a thick stack of folded documents. The crisp white papers looked like a death sentence in his hands. "I hold federal arrest warrants for both Winston Davis and Julian Davis," Devon announced, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "The charges are extensive and carry mandatory minimum sentences. You are both being charged with federal wire fraud, money laundering across international borders, and multiple counts of mortgage fraud related to the illegal transfer of this estate and several commercial properties in the Atlanta metro area." Julian, who was still curled up at the bottom of the grand staircase, let out a pathetic high-pitched squeal. He scrambled backward, his expensive leather shoes slipping on the marble as he tried to get away from the federal agent stepping toward him. "No," Julian sobbed, pointing a shaking finger at me. "Harper said I was not going to prison. She said I just had to be a janitor at her company. She said Nana Trust would let me stay out of jail if I just cleaned the toilets. You cannot arrest me. I did not do anything wrong. Dad told me to sign those papers. Dad told me the offshore accounts were just tax shelters." I looked at my brother, feeling an absolute icy detachment. Julian was so incredibly stupid, he did not even understand the difference between a civil family trust and criminal federal law. Nana Letter had stripped him of his inheritance and offered him a pathetic job to survive, but that was a private family matter. The federal government did not care about a janitor contract. They cared about the millions of dollars Julian had personally helped launder through his dummy shell companies. He had blindly signed federal mortgage documents and wire transfers because he was too lazy to read them and too greedy to care where the money came from. Blair was already sitting on the floor with her knees pulled to her chest, weeping silently as an agent stood over her reading her Miranda rights. She knew it was over. But my mother Celeste was a different story entirely. Celeste had spent her entire existence cultivating an image of flawless, untouchable perfection. She had married Winston because he promised her a kingdom, and she had ruthlessly guarded that kingdom by destroying anyone who threatened her status. She had thrown her own daughter to the wolves just to protect the illusion of her wealthy, perfect family. And now she was watching her husband and her golden child being read their federal charges, realizing that she was about to lose her mansion, her luxury cars, her designer wardrobe, and every single country club membership she held dear. She was about to be the wife of a convicted felon. The reality broke her completely. The poised, elegant society matriarch vanished, leaving behind a desperate, terrified woman who was watching her entire universe collapse into dust. Celeste dropped to her knees on the hard marble floor, the remaining unbroken pearls from her necklace scattered across the ground. Her carefully pinned hair fell around her face in a wild, messy tangle, and her expensive couture gown bunched up around her legs as she began to crawl. She literally crawled across the floor of the grand foyer, ignoring the stares of the police officers and the federal agents. She reached me before I could step away. Celeste threw her arms around my legs, burying her tear-streaked face against my trousers. She gripped my ankles so tightly her manicured nails dug into my skin. "Harper, please!" Celeste wailed, her voice a guttural, agonizing sound that echoed over the steady rain outside. "Please save us. You are the only one who can stop this. You have the money, Harper. You have the power. You can hire the best lawyers in the country. You can pay whatever fines they want. Please do not let them take your father and your brother away." I looked down at the woman who had birthed me, feeling no warmth, no pity, and no connection. She was a stranger begging for a bailout. I tried to pull my leg away, but she clung to me with desperate, frantic strength, her tears soaking into the fabric of my clothes. "I am so sorry," Harper Celeste sobbed, refusing to let go. "I was wrong. I was so wrong about everything. I should have been a better mother to you. I should have protected you." She looked up at me, her face a mask of manufactured misery, and launched into the most toxic, pathetic excuse a parent could ever offer a child. She thought she could manipulate my emotions one last time. She thought she could weaponize my own survival against me. "You have to understand why I favored Julian, Celeste," wept her voice trembling with dramatic sorrow. "You have to understand why I gave him everything and left you with nothing. Julian was always so weak, Harper. He was so fragile and he needed me to survive. He could not do anything on his own. But you, Harper, you were always so incredibly strong. You never needed me. You were so independent and capable from the time you were a little girl. I thought you could handle anything the world threw at you. I only neglected you because I knew you were strong enough to survive on your own. I thought my strong, beautiful girl did not need her mother. I stared down at her, listening to her twist her own cruelty into a twisted compliment. She was trying to use my resilience as a justification for her abuse. She wanted me to believe that she abandoned me because she believed in my strength, when the reality was, she abandoned me because I refused to be a compliant accessory in her fake perfect life. The anger I felt was not hot or explosive. It was freezing cold. It was a glacial, absolute certainty that this woman was entirely rotten to her core. I reached down and gripped her wrists, prying her hands off my legs with a sharp, forceful motion. I pushed her back so she was kneeling on the floor in front of me, no longer touching me. I did not need you because I was strong. Celeste, I said, my voice echoing clearly in the silent room. I became strong because I realized very early on that if I relied on you, I would not survive. I reached into the inner pocket of my designer handbag. My fingers brushed against a folded piece of heavy paper. It was a document I had kept with me for 7 long years. I had moved it from purse to purse, briefcase to briefcase, waiting for the exact moment when my mother would try to use this specific excuse. I knew she would eventually try to blame my independence for her neglect, and I had kept the receipts. I pulled the crisp folded document from my bag and let it fall open. The clinical black text and the hospital logo stood out sharply under the bright chandelier light. I held it out, dropping it onto the marble floor right in front of her trembling knees. Celeste stared down at the paper, her weeping suddenly pausing as she read the bold print at the top of the medical discharge form. "You thought I was strong enough to handle anything," I said, my words slicing through her pathetic sobbing. "Read that document, Celeste. Read the date. Read the diagnosis." Celeste's hands shook as she picked up the paper. Her eyes scanned the text and all the color drained from her face, leaving her looking like a hollow ghost. "That is my medical chart from my junior year of college," I continued, making sure every person in the room heard the truth. "That is the official hospital record from the week I collapsed in the campus library because my internal organs were beginning to shut down from severe malnutrition and physical exhaustion. I was not strong, Celeste. I was dying. My body was eating itself because I was working 3 minimum wage jobs to pay for my classes while you were buying Julian a new sports car." I took a step closer, looking down into her horrified eyes. "I called you from that hospital bed," I said, my voice completely devoid of mercy. "I told you my kidneys were failing. I told you the doctors would not let me leave without paying the emergency room deposit. I cried, and I begged my mother to help me. And do you remember what you said to me?" Celeste squeezed her eyes shut, shaking her head desperately, trying to block out the memory. But I would not let her hide. "You told me to stop being dramatic," I stated coldly. "You told me that I was embarrassing the family by going to a public county hospital. You told me that you could not wire me any money because you had just put a deposit down on a country club wedding venue for a cousin I barely knew. You hung up the phone on your own daughter while she was attached to an IV drip." The guests in the room murmured in absolute horror. Devin's jaw clenched tight as he watched my mother squirm. He had seen the scars on my arms from the plasma donation center, but hearing the full reality of what they had done still made him furious. "I did not survive because I was strong, Celeste," I said, looking at her as if she were a stranger. "I survived because I sold pieces of my own body to a blood plasma clinic twice a week just to buy groceries. I survived by bleeding for strangers because my own blood family left me to starve. So do not ever kneel on the floor and tell me you neglected me because of my strength. You neglected me because you are a selfish, hollow parasite who only cares about things you can show off to your friends." Celeste dropped the medical document as if it had burned her fingers. She slumped forward, placing her hands flat against the cold marble, completely and utterly defeated. There were no more excuses left to make. There were no more lies she could spin to save herself. She had been stripped bare in front of everyone she respected, and the ugly, rotting truth was finally exposed. Devin stepped forward, signaling the agents. "Take them," he ordered, his voice leaving no room for negotiation. The federal agents hauled Winston to his feet, pulling him toward the front doors as he openly sobbed. They grabbed Julian, who was hyperventilating and stammering incoherently, lifting him by his expensive suit jacket. Two agents pulled Celeste up from the floor, guiding the silent, weeping woman out of the grand foyer. Blair followed behind them, her head bowed, accepting her fate without a single word. I stood next to my husband, watching the agents march my rotten family out into the pouring rain. The flashing lights of the armored vehicles illuminated the darkness, throwing long shadows across the driveway. The heavy doors of the transport vans slammed shut with a series of loud metallic thuds, echoing like a final heavy gavel strike against the storm. The engines roared to life, and the convoy began to roll down the long gravel driveway, taking Winston, Celeste, Julian, and Blair out of my life and into the federal justice system where they belonged. The remaining guests slowly began to file out of the estate, keeping their heads down, too ashamed and terrified to even make eye contact with me. They had come to witness the coronation of the Golden Child, and instead they had watched the complete demolition of a corrupt empire. Within minutes, the grand foyer was completely empty except for Devin and me. The silence in the massive house was deep and profound. The air no longer felt thick with lies and pretense. It felt clear. It felt incredibly clean. Devin reached down and picked up the medical document from the marble floor, folding it carefully and placing it in his pocket. He turned to me, pulling me into a warm, solid embrace. I rested my head against his tactical jacket, listening to the steady, reliable beat of his heart. I wrapped my arms around him, holding him tightly. The nightmare was finally over. The house was mine. My future was mine. And the people who had tried to break me were finally going to pay for every single thing they had done. Devin motioned for his federal agents to take them all out into the raging coastal storm. Winston was completely broken, sobbing quietly as the cold steel handcuffs locked around his wrists. Blair was already walking toward the door, her head down in total defeat, knowing her life of luxury was entirely over. But just as an agent reached for my mother, Celeste suddenly snapped. The reality of losing her entire fabricated universe was simply too much for her fragile ego to bear. The perfectly curated society wife, who had spent decades orchestrating everyone around her, completely unraveled. She violently jerked her arms away from the federal agent who was trying to detain her. She spun around and threw her body backward toward the center of the grand foyer, her expensive couture gown ripping at the seams as she dropped her dead weight onto the hard marble floor. She scrambled across the polished stone, her movements frantic and utterly pathetic. Before Devin could step between us, Celeste lunged forward and threw her arms around my legs, pulling herself against me in a desperate embrace. She buried her tear-streaked face against my trousers, sobbing so loudly that it echoed off the crystal chandeliers above us. "Harper, please!" she wailed, her voice cracking into a high-pitched shriek. "I am so sorry. I was so wrong about everything. Please, you have to believe me. It is just because you were always so incredibly strong, Harper. You were so fiercely independent from the time you were a little girl. I thought you did not need me. I thought Julian was the weak one who needed a mother to survive. But you were always so capable. I only pushed you away because your strength intimidated me. I was just a mother trying to help the child who needed it most. Please, Harper, do not let them take me away. I love you. You are my daughter." I stood completely still, looking down at the woman who had spent my entire life trying to destroy my spirit. The elite guests, who were still huddled against the walls of the foyer, watched in absolute stunned silence as the untouchable Celeste Davis groveled on the floor like a common criminal begging for mercy from the child she had repeatedly thrown out on the street. I did not feel a single ounce of sympathy. Her tears were nothing more than a final desperate performance from a woman who had run out of lies to tell. She was trying to weaponize my own survival against me, trying to frame her decades of abuse as some twisted form of maternal respect. I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored blazer, and my fingers closed around a folded piece of paper. I had kept this specific document hidden for a very long time, waiting for the exact moment when the truth would finally corner her. I pulled the crisp white page from my pocket and let it slip through my fingers. The paper fluttered down through the cold air of the foyer, landing softly on the marble floor right next to her trembling hands. "Stop acting, Celeste," I said, my voice dropping to a glacial dead calm that cut through her hysterical sobbing instantly. "Stop playing the remorseful mother right now. You and I both know that your sudden change in behavior had absolutely nothing to do with my independence, and it had nothing to do with my strength." Celeste froze, her hands still clutching my legs. She slowly looked down at the piece of paper resting on the floor. The bold black letters at the top of the page belonged to a highly exclusive private genetic testing laboratory in Atlanta. The date stamped on the document was exactly 17 years ago. "I know exactly why you hated me since the day I turned 10 years old." I continued, speaking clearly so that every single person in the room could hear the absolute truth. "I know why you suddenly stopped looking at me like a daughter and started looking at me like an infection you could not wash away. I am Winston Child from another woman." A collective gasp rippled through the grand foyer. The wealthy socialites and politicians who had spent years envying my parents' perfect marriage were now staring at them in absolute disgust. "I am the product of an affair Winston had before your precious high society marriage was even fully cemented," I said, looking directly at Winston, who had frozen in the doorway. "You only agreed to take me in and raise me as your own because Nana discovered the affair and threatened to cut Winston completely out of her massive trust fund if he abandoned his own blood. You were forced to bring another woman child into your pristine home. You agreed to play the loving mother just to keep up your perfect socialite image and to guarantee your unrestricted access to the Wilson family fortune. Julian is your only biological child." The heavy silence in the room was deafening. The rain continued to lash against the massive windows, but nobody inside the estate dared to breathe. Winston stood by the front doors, completely paralyzed. The federal agents holding his arms watched his face drain of all color until his skin turned an ashen gray. His jaw dropped open and his eyes bulged out of his head as he stared at his wife groveling on the floor. Even Winston did not know. He had spent the last 2 decades believing his affair was a buried secret that Celeste had graciously forgiven and tucked away to protect their social standing. He honestly believed he had controlled the narrative. He had absolutely no idea that Celeste had secretly plucked a strand of my hair and run a private DNA test behind his back all those years ago to confirm what her paranoid mind already suspected. The absolute staggering hypocrisy of their entire marriage was laying bare in the center of the room, destroying them both from the inside out. The perfect socialite wife had spent 17 years quietly punishing an innocent child for her husband's infidelity, all while draining the family accounts to spoil her own biological son. Winston had cowardly watched his wife torture his daughter and had allowed it to happen because he was too terrified of losing his country club status to ever stand up for me. They had built a kingdom of glass on a foundation of betrayal and lies, and now every single shard was raining down on them. "You punished me every single day for a sin I did not commit," I said, looking down at Celeste, whose face was now twisted in a mask of pure terror. "You bought Julian luxury cars and threw me out in the rain because every time you looked at my face, you saw the woman your husband actually wanted. You stole from charities and bankrupted this family to prop up your own biological son because you were absolutely desperate to prove that your bloodline was superior to mine. But look at where your precious biology got you, Celeste. Your son is a federal criminal, and you are going to spend the rest of your life in a concrete box." Celeste dropped the medical document as if it had burned her fingers. She slumped forward, placing her hands flat against the cold marble, completely and utterly defeated. There were no more excuses left to make. There were no more lies she could spin to save herself. She had been stripped bare in front of everyone she respected, and the ugly, rotting truth was finally exposed. She realized in that exact moment that she had traded her entire soul for a lifestyle she no longer possessed. Julian, who had been standing near the staircase, suddenly realized the full catastrophic weight of what was happening. His entire life had been a carefully constructed lie. His superiority complex, his arrogant belief that he was the golden child, the chosen heir to the family legacy, it was all completely fabricated. He was not special. He was just the only biological child of a miserable, toxic woman who had used him as a weapon to get back at her cheating husband. His entire lavish lifestyle had been funded by the trust of a grandmother who fundamentally despised his mother and knew the truth all along. As a federal agent stepped forward and firmly grabbed Julian's arms, the reality of his future finally snapped his fragile, pampered mind. The golden boy was broke in massive debt and about to be indicted on federal wire fraud and money laundering charges because he was too stupid to realize his mother was using him to destroy the family. Julian began to scream. It was not a normal shout of protest. It was a high-pitched, terrifying, maniacal wail that tore through his throat and echoed violently off the marble walls. He thrashed against the agents, kicking his expensive leather shoes against the floor, sobbing and shrieking like a cornered animal. He screamed at Winston for lying to him. He screamed at Celeste for ruining his life. He completely lost his grip on reality right in front of the Atlanta elite, thrashing his head back and forth as the agents forced him toward the ground to secure him. The sharp metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs snapping tightly around Julian's wrists echoed through the foyer, cutting through his hysterical screaming like a final judgment. The agents easily overpowered his pathetic thrashing, locking him into his new reality. The boy who had never worked a day in his life was finally experiencing the brutal consequences of his own arrogance. "Take them out of my house," I said to Devon, my voice completely steady. Devon nodded, his eyes hard and unforgiving as he looked at the ruins of the family that had once treated him like dirt. He signaled his team, and the agents moved in unison. They hauled Celeste up from the floor by her arms, ignoring her fresh wails of despair. They dragged Julian toward the door while he continued to scream and cry, thrashing wildly against their grip. Winston just shuffled forward like a dead man, walking completely broken by the realization that his wife had hated him for 20 years, and his entire life was a shameful, miserable lie. The heavy oak doors opened one last time, and the cold storm swallowed them whole, leaving me standing in the silence of my own house. The silence in my own house lasted for only a fraction of a second. A sudden loud crash from the east wing hallway shattered the profound peace. Blair had apparently realized that following Celeste and Winston out the front doors meant surrendering to a decade in a federal penitentiary. She had managed to slip away from the main group during Celeste's dramatic breakdown on the floor. Blair thought she could navigate the maze of servant corridors and sneak out through the catering exit in the back of the estate. She actually believed she could just walk away from the millions of dollars she helped Julian launder and return to her life of leisure. But she did not make it far. A female federal agent with a tight blonde ponytail and an absolutely uncompromising expression marched Blair back into the grand foyer. The agent had one hand firmly locked onto Blair's elbow, twisting it just enough to keep the aspiring socialite off balance and moving forward. Blair was sobbing uncontrollably, her heavy, expensive makeup running down her face in dark, jagged lines, ruining the silk collar of her designer dress. She pleaded with the agent, offering her diamond jewelry and promising that she had absolutely no idea what Julian and Winston were doing with the charity funds. She played the victim perfectly, weeping that she was just a naive girl who fell in love with the wrong wealthy man. The female agent did not even blink, dragging her forward with cold professional efficiency and pushing her out the heavy front doors. Just as the agent shoved Blair out into the driving storm, I followed them, stepping out onto the massive covered portico. The storm was raging, the wind whipping through the large stone columns, but the harsh glare of the federal vehicle headlights illuminated the circular driveway perfectly. Julian was still putting up a pathetic, desperate fight. Two massive federal agents were trying to force him into the back of a black armored SUV, but he had braced his expensive Italian leather shoes against the doorframe, refusing to fold his body into the vehicle. His custom-tailored suit was soaked through, plastered to his skin by the freezing rain. His perfectly styled hair was flattened to his forehead, making him look like a drowned rat. He saw me standing on the top step under the protection of the portico roof, and his panic morphed into a venomous, frantic rage. He spat pure poison at me, cursing my name over the sound of the thunder and the idling engines. He called me a jealous, bitter outcast who had manipulated her way into his rightful inheritance. He yelled that I was a pathetic excuse for a sister who could not stand to see him succeed and be loved by our parents. He swore that this was not over, that he would hire the most ruthless and expensive defense attorneys in the country, and that he would be back to take everything from me. He screamed that my little corporate victory meant nothing because the Davis family fortune would crush me in civil court. He promised to destroy my business, my marriage, and my life the very second he posted bail. I walked slowly down the wet stone steps, ignoring the rain that whipped against my face and soaked my own clothes. Devin stood nearby, watching closely, but letting me handle my brother. The federal agents paused for a fraction of a second, allowing me to step right up to Julian. He was panting heavily, his face pressed against the wet roof of the SUV by the agent's hands. I leaned in close so only he could hear me over the chaotic noise of the storm and the flashing sirens. "They never told you, did they?" I whispered, my voice calm and completely empty of any sibling affection. "Even the Audi you drive is registered to my holding company. The luxury penthouse you live in was collateralized through one of Winston Dummy Shell Corporations, which my firm completely acquired and liquidated last week. You have absolutely nothing left to hire a lawyer with, Julian. Your bank accounts are permanently frozen, your credit cards are canceled, and your precious trust fund has been dissolved to pay back the sanctuary church fund you stole from. As of tomorrow morning, you are officially homeless. You are..." Julian stopped struggling entirely. His eyes widened to the size of dinner plates as the reality of my words finally penetrated his thick, arrogant skull. The delusion that his father money would save him shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The fight completely drained out of his body, leaving him as limp as a wet rag doll in the agent's grip. He realized he was not going back to a luxury penthouse or a fleet of sports cars. He was going to a concrete cell with absolutely nothing to his name. He let out a pathetic, high-pitched wail, a sound of pure, unadulterated despair, as the agents shoved him into the dark interior of the SUV and slammed the heavy door, shutting off his screams forever. I turned around and walked back up the stone steps, wiping the cold rain from my cheek. Devin placed a warm, solid hand on the small of my back, guiding me back into the grand foyer. The heavy oak doors were pulled shut by the remaining local police officers, locking the storm outside and leaving us once again in the warm, brightly lit space of the estate. But the massive room was not empty. The dozens of elite VIPs, politicians, corporate bankers, and local socialites were still trapped inside, waiting out the federal raid. Earlier that evening, these exact same people had openly mocked me. They had whispered behind their crystal champagne flutes about my cheap clothes and my blue-collar husband. They had treated my parents like absolute royalty, hanging on their every word and kissing the ground they walked on. They had treated me like the hired catering staff, an unwanted stain on the perfect family portrait. But the dynamic in the room had shifted with an aggressive, terrifying whiplash. They had just watched me systematically dismantle the most powerful, corrupt family in their social circle. They had seen the federal agents defer to my husband, and they knew exactly who owned the ground they were currently standing on. The air in the room was thick with the suffocating smell of their fear and their desperate need for self-preservation. As I stepped toward the center of the foyer, smoothing the lapels of my damp jacket, the crowd of elites suddenly rushed forward like a flock of starving pigeons. The transformation was both magnificent and entirely repulsive. Their faces were stretched into the most grotesque fake smiles I had ever seen. The mayor, who had been practically begging Winston for campaign donations just an hour ago, actually tripped over his own expensive shoes to reach me first. "Harper, my dear Harper," the mayor gushed, holding his hands out as if we were old friends. "I always knew there was something terribly wrong with Winston accounting practices. I was actually planning to launch a city investigation next month. Your business acumen is simply extraordinary to have caught this before the city did. We must have lunch to discuss future city contracts with your firm." He was sweating profusely, terrified that his own shady dealings with my father would be uncovered by Devon federal agents. He was trying to flatter the new boss to ensure he did not end up in the back of an armored SUV himself. The society matrons who had laughed at me crowded around, pushing each other out of the way to compliment my resilience. They fawned over my damp clothes, telling me that my understated style was so refreshing compared to Celeste's gaudy and tasteless displays of wealth. The bank executives who had happily approved Winston fraudulent loans shoved their business cards at Devon and me, promising exclusive interest rates and offering groveling apologies for ever doubting my financial credibility. They told me they had always admired my quiet strength and that they knew I was the true genius of the family all along. It was a masterclass in human hypocrisy. They were desperate, terrified parasites who only respected raw power and money. They did not care that my parents had just been arrested for stealing from underprivileged children in their own community. They only cared that the power vacuum had been filled by someone they desperately needed to appease. They smiled and complimented me while their eyes darted nervously to the federal badge still gleaming on Devon's chest. I looked at the sea of fake desperate faces, feeling a deep, profound sense of closure. I did not need their validation, and I certainly did not want their friendship. I had spent my entire youth trying to prove my worth to people who were fundamentally empty inside. I looked up at Devon, who was watching the groveling crowd with a look of quiet amusement. He wrapped his arm around my shoulders, pulling me close. "Gentlemen and ladies," Devon said, his deep voice cutting through their pathetic chattering. "The property is now under federal jurisdiction and private ownership. The catering staff has been dismissed and the exits are now clear. I suggest you all find your vehicles and drive home safely. And if any of your names appear in Winston Davis financial ledgers, you can expect a knock on your door very soon." The threat hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. The fake smiles immediately dropped from their faces, replaced by genuine, stark terror. The crowd scrambled toward the exits, pushing and shoving each other to escape the foyer as quickly as possible. They abandoned their expensive coats and their designer umbrellas, sprinting out into the freezing rain, desperate to get as far away from the estate as they could before the agents decided to ask them any questions. Within minutes, the massive house was finally silent. The jazz music was gone, the toxic relatives were gone, and the fake friends had scattered into the night. I stood in the center of the beautiful foyer, breathing in the quiet peace of my new reality. The heavy weight of my past had finally been lifted entirely. I had taken out the trash, and for the first time in my life, the house was completely clean. But the absolute silence in the grand foyer did not extend to the formal parlor just down the hall. While the smart politicians and the terrified bankers had sprinted out into the freezing storm, the truly shameless parasites had lingered behind. These were the people whose entire existence relied on latching on to whoever held the biggest checkbook, and they were not about to leave without securing their next meal ticket. As Devon agents packed up their tactical gear and began to pull their heavily armored vehicles out of the circular driveway, these lingering socialites crept back into the grand entryway like roaches crawling out from under the expensive baseboards. They swarmed around me, their faces plastered with those sickeningly sweet country club smiles, desperately trying to rewrite history in real time. The local charity board president, a woman who had ignored every single email I had sent her for 5 years, reached out and tried to affectionately touch my arm. She gushed about how she had always known I was the brilliant one in the family, and how she always thought Celeste was entirely too tacky for their elite circle. A prominent real estate developer who had openly laughed at Devon's modest vehicle just an hour earlier actually tried to offer us a round of drinks at his private club. He stood there with a straight face and claimed that he always preferred doing business with the smart Wilson daughter, and that he was relieved to see my father finally removed from the industry. I looked at their greedy, calculating eyes and felt a wave of absolute revulsion wash over my entire body. These were the people who had enabled my parents for decades. They had gladly looked the other way, while Winston stole from the community, and they had happily clinked champagne glasses with Celeste, while she emotionally destroyed her own daughter. They did not care about justice or morality. They only cared about preserving their own status. I did not need their validation, and I certainly did not need a place in their fake plastic society. I raised my hand, signaling the elite private security team I had hired earlier that week to secure the perimeter of the estate. Half a dozen tall men in dark suits stepped forward immediately, their presence instantly silencing the pathetic, flattering whispers of the crowd. I looked directly at the charity president and the real estate developer, letting my absolute disgust show plainly on my face. "Get out of my house," I said, my voice echoing sharply off the marble floors. "And if any of you ever try to contact my company or speak to my husband again, I will personally have my legal team dig into exactly how much your businesses benefited from my father's stolen funds. I will make sure the federal investigators audit every single charity gala and real estate deal you ever coordinated with Winston Davis." The fake smiles instantly melted off their faces, replaced by stark, genuine panic. All the color drained from their perfectly tanned skin as my private security team forcefully marched them toward the exit. The guards did not care about their designer dresses or their expensive tailored suits. They physically escorted the remaining sycophants out the front doors, pushing them directly into the freezing coastal storm and slamming the heavy oak doors shut behind them with a satisfying final thud. Devin walked over and gently took my hand, leading me away from the grand foyer and out toward the massive back balcony that overlooked the private beach. The violent coastal storm was finally beginning to break. The dark, heavy clouds were splitting apart over the horizon, revealing the stunning, glowing colors of an ocean sunset. The harsh wind had died down, leaving behind a crisp, clean breeze that smelled like salt and fresh rain. As we stood there leaning against the stone railing, the heavy iron gates at the bottom of the long gravel driveway slowly swung open again. But this time it was not police cruisers or luxury sedans rolling onto the property. 3 large commercial charter buses pulled slowly up the winding drive, parking right where Winston imported sports cars used to sit. I watched with a genuine smile as the bus doors opened and dozens of high school students began to file out onto the wet gravel. They were carrying heavy backpacks and sporting massive, excited smiles, pointing at the sheer size of the estate. These were the kids from the actual community outreach programs I had been quietly funding for the past 3 years. They were the underprivileged youth from the neighborhoods Winston had redlined and abandoned. They were the kids whose futures my father had actively tried to steal to fund Celeste Country Club lifestyle. This estate was no longer going to be a monument to fake wealth and toxic greed. I had already filed the paperwork to transform the massive property into a permanent retreat and educational center for the foundations I actually cared about. These kids were going to walk the halls where Celeste used to host her pretentious galas, and they were going to learn how to build their own businesses and secure their own futures. This was the true legacy I wanted to protect and nurture. Devin handed me a glass of rich red wine, wrapping his strong arm around my waist as we listened to the beautiful sound of the students laughing and marveling at the architecture. The dark chapter of my life was officially closed. Suddenly, my phone buzzed in the pocket of my blazer. I pulled it out and looked at the bright screen. It was a text message from an unknown number, but I knew exactly who was frantically borrowing a phone from the local holding cell downtown. "Please, Harper." The message read, the desperation practically bleeding through the digital text. "I am so hungry and it is so cold in here. The food is disgusting and they took my clothes. Can you just send a lawyer, please? I am your mother. I will do anything." I stared at the pathetic words sent by the woman who had once let me starve in a hospital bed without a single second thought. She was finally experiencing a fraction of the helpless terror she had inflicted on me for years. A soft, gentle smile spread across my face as I looked at the glowing screen. I did not feel angry anymore. I just felt entirely free. I did not type a single letter in response. I simply hit the block button and slid the phone back into my pocket, letting Celeste Davis vanish into the digital void forever. I leaned my head against Devon's solid shoulder and raised my glass to the brilliant ocean sunset. The toxic parasites were gone, and my life was finally completely cleared of trash. The most profound lesson from this story is that your worth is never defined by those who underestimate you, even if they share your DNA. True family should provide unconditional support, not toxic competition or betrayal. When you are constantly treated as a scapegoat, walking away is not a failure. It is the ultimate act of self-love and courage. True power comes from quietly building your own independence and success on your own terms. Ultimately, living a happy, authentic life is the sweetest revenge possible. Subscribe to our channel and share your own stories of overcoming toxic relatives down below.